Hi there, I'm Jack Lynch and welcome to my workbench. For those of you who have been kind of keeping an eye on our AAA Hobbies scale modeling group or the AAA Facebook page, I'm working on a diorama. I'm using an American armored car in 1/35th scale, and I've shown a lot of progress photos, and I'm at the point with this diorama where I've got the vehicle almost done. I've got the base almost finished, except for the secondary operations after everything's mounted. And I'm at a point which kind of tricks a lot of people up, which is the figures. I've got 3 figures on this diorama, and there's 2 American soldiers and a German soldier. I have the German soldier over here, and I've already painted him. He's finished. So that's the aggressor in the diorama. That's the German soldier, 1944 Battle of the Bulge. Now, I have 2 other figures that go with the American vehicle. I have an American wounded soldier that's in the vehicle, and I have his comrade that's outside the vehicle standing there surrendering to the German soldier. And that's these 2 figures right here. And you can see them both. Now, if you look at these figures closely, you can see I've already put base coat on them. And we'll get into that a little bit into the video. But what I'd like to do is take a minute to just go over some figure painting fundamentals. Figure painting kind of stops people in their tracks because it is difficult. It's not really easy to make a little plastic guy look convincing and look 3-dimensional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk just a little bit about some source material, things you can read to get yourself up to speed, and then talk about the tools that we're going to use and the type of paint that I use. Well, you've built a model or designed a diorama, and you need to put some people in it. You need to put some figures on it. And it's really important to do this if you're trying to tell a story, because figures tell the story. I mean, they show the action. And the thing about figures is they're the first thing that a person's eyes go to when they look at a model, and you have figures with it. If you place figures around it, people are automatically going to look there first. So what's the first thing you do? Okay, the figures that I have in my diorama are older kit figures from the 1970s. They're Valiant figures. Valiant was a company that made lead figures for many, many years, and growing up I built a lot of them, and these were ones that I always wanted to do this set because they gave you an option to do the set of figures. It's 2 figures, but you can do them 4 ways. In other words, the way I'm doing it is like this, where the German soldier is capturing the American soldier at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. You can also, they give you 2 sets of arms for each of the figures, so that you can do it the opposite way with the American soldier capturing the German soldier, which is the end of the Battle of the Bulge. So I'm starting out doing the beginning. I'm doing the German soldier capturing the American soldiers, and then when I'm done, I have another set. I bought another set of figures and switched the arms around so I can do it the opposite way, so I can have the beginning and the end of the battle. So I have the figures here, and the first thing you really need to do with figures is prep them. And you really need to prep them well, because they're little, and each piece of this figure, if it's a plastic kit especially, the older lead kits, resin kits not so much, but if you use, this is a box of figures. This is a Dragon set of figures that I bought for reference. And these are Battle of the Bulge figures, and this is the sprue of figures as it comes out of this box. So I have to cut each part of this figure off, which is the torso, the arms, the legs, the head, and the equipage that goes with them. And when you look at them, when they make a mold like this, it's a 2-piece mold. So it's like this. In other words, the steel goes together, they shoot this plastic into it, then they pull it apart, and this piece pops out. That leaves a seam line around every single part where the 2 mold halves came apart. So you have to look at each one of these parts and see where the seam line is. And it's usually right down the center, around the torso or around the edge of a leg. And they do it so that it's not hard to clean off. But if you really want your figures to look good and convincing, you need to clean those little lines off before you put it together and prime it. And that way it doesn't look like a plastic eye with a big giant seam line going down the middle of him. That's really important. I mean, it's really fundamental and most people know it, but for those of you who haven't done it, it makes a huge difference. You've picked your figures out. You've posed them on the diorama, cleaned them up and assembled them. So what's the first step? The first step is to prime the figure. And you have a choice. I always use Tamiya primer. I use either gray or white Tamiya fine primer. This stuff is excellent. This is really, really, really good primer. Can't, say that enough. Really, really great product. So this is the opposite German. This is the surrendering German for my second diorama. The first German's down here on the diorama, and I've already painted him, and he's mounted, but my two Americans aren't painted yet. So I assembled them, I primed them, and then I went ahead, and what I do is, before I do anything, I get myself a small block of wood. And I just happen to have one of them right here that I use for this American figure. So what I do is, after I get them posed and I clean them up and I prime them, I mount them to a block of wood with pins. There's little tiny pins in his feet. You can see them right there. So the pins go into the holes in my block of wood. Bear with me here. Oh, guess what? I have the German's block. This is the American's block of wood. See, he pops right into this block of wood, and what I do is I glue him onto the block, and then I take acrylic paint. Now, the next step to think about is what kind of paint do you use to paint your figures? And myself, I use an acrylic base, and then I paint oil paints over the acrylic. Why? Because oil paints are very vibrant pigments. They look really great, and they don't dull down. Sometimes you'll notice if you use acrylic paint, it's good stuff, and it looks good, but you don't get the depth and you don't get the real deep hues that you get with an oil pigment. So basically, I've taken my figure, I mount them on here, and I get some acrylic paint. And I like to use Vallejo acrylic paints. Buy these at AAA Hobbies. They have a complete selection, a whole rack of these things, and it's great because if you need a color, you can jump right in your car, right over to the store and grab it. So acrylic paints, and that's what this figure right here has on him right now. He has the base colors that I'm going to paint this figure. And you say, well, he looks like he's painted. Well, he isn't. He's just base colored. There are no shadows, there's no highlights, there's no depth to this figure. If I take my German figure here and I show him to you, you'll notice that he has a lot of depth and he has a lot of shadows painted into him, and he looks finished. So next step will be discussing paint. So there's no way in a short video that I could show you how to paint a figure from beginning to the very end. So what I'd like to do is, and I'll extend an invitation, anybody that wants to come to AAA Hobbies, say on a Saturday or Sunday, and take a figure painting class, contact us. Send us a note or give us a call and let us know, yeah, I'd like to see figure painting, I'd like to get involved. So if I get enough people, I'll put on a demo and we can sit down for a few hours and I can paint, and you can bring some and paint with me. But I digress. What I'd like to do is just basically go over fundamentals. In other words, I'm going to show you kind of the tools that I use and the techniques and the books that I've read, and you can kind of, and I'll do some painting and I'll take some video of the steps as I go along and show it. But I'd like to start out just by kind of discussing paint and tools and literature or research that you can do. I'll start out with the books. The best book, and I always go back to this because there's a lot of different ways to paint figures, and there's a lot of different people doing it in different ways, with acrylics, with oil paint, with enamels, blending, all kinds of different things, layering paints. I go back to I consider this my Bible. This is Shep Payne's book on figure painting. It's basically called Building and Painting Scale Figures by Shepard Payne. This book has everything you need to know about converting, assembling, painting, displaying figures, military figures and display figures. That's what we're basically talking about, military miniatures. What I do is I use his basic face guide. Here, I'll show this to you as I do it, and it's basically a step-by-step on the face that shows you how to lay colors in. It'll show you how to lay a basic flesh tone, shades, dark shades, light shades, highlights, to achieve a three-dimensional effect. So this is This book I don't think is still in publication, but I'm sure you can get it through different online, sites, merchandisers. So it's Shep Payne's book, and he also had out a book on how to build dioramas, which has the figure information inside of it. There's not quite as much figure stuff in the diorama book, but his book on how to build dioramas by Shep Payne is also a really great source of information on assembling, painting, and displaying figures. So once you read a little bit, or if you just want to dive right in, you have to think about what kind of paint you want to use. Some people use acrylic paint, and I showed the Vallejo colors. The Vallejo paints and acrylic paints in general, the way I look at it is you build layers with this. In other words, you start and you thin it down and you put what they call glazes on the figure, which means you build up your colors. You start with a darker color and it goes down in all the recesses and shades on the shirt and on the pants and everything. And you can see where the shadows are. And then you start to build up the color lighter as you go up. And it sounds really complicated, but it's not, because you just mix the paint down kind of thin and you put it on, you see where it flows, and then you add colors on top of that. And this is good stuff. I use this as a base coat. In other words, I use it pretty thick out of the bottle. I don't thin it very much. I put a little bit of the glaze thinner in it, and then I'll just paint the basic colors on. In other words, I would paint this shirt dark, like a black all the way, and I would paint all the base colors, like you saw on the American figure. He's ready to paint with oils now. So the other kind of paint you can use would be Humbrol enamels, and I really like Humbrol paint. I grew up using Humbrol. I think it's great paint. I use Humbrol, you'll see, a lot for details. After I'm done painting with the oils and I go back to do belt buckles and guns and boots and the hardware, I use a lot of Humbrol paint for that. And Humbrol mixes down with just regular enamel thinner. This is Testor's thinner. I use that all the time because it comes in these big jars. So Humbrol is a great paint. And Humbrol is kind of like the acrylics in the sense that you kind of layer it on. You put you thin it down and you put it on and let it flow in and see where it goes. Some figure painters just do that. They thin dark washes down and they put washes on their figures, and it brings the detail out. I personally like to highlight and shadow and paint with oils and go in and be kind of exact with my colors. It looks a lot better. So you've got acrylics, you've got enamels, and then my favorite, which is oil paint. So now that we've put the base coats in acrylic on that figure, I'll take my oil paint, and you go out, and this is handy for more than just oil painting. Go out and get yourself a paper palette, or a palette of paper. It's basically emulsion paper, which means it has a coating on each sheet of paper. It's a pad of paper, and you can mix your paint right on this and it won't soak down into the paper because it has a waxy kind of coating on it. It's great for mixing epoxy glue. It's great for, I use it for my Humbrol paint. For these little paints, I take the Humbrol paint and I put a little bit on there, and I take some thinner and just kind of mix it in. But paper palette, it's really, really useful. There's a whole lot of them on there and they last forever, well, at least a month or two. So get yourself a paper palette. These are the oil paints I use. I use Winsor Newton oil colors. These are suggested by Shepard Payne in the book, and I've used them ever since. And the neat thing about oil paints is if you get a set of primary colors, you can mix just about every color in the rainbow. So you don't have to be buying tons and tons of little bottles of paint. You can just buy 5 or 6 colors and mix all the different colors you need. The basic colors that I use, we'll talk about flesh. And I use gold ochre, which is this color here. I use burnt sienna. I use white. I use a little bit of red, a little bit of black, and that'll do everything on the face. The other thing that you're going to need to think about are brushes. Figure painting, people think you need minuscule little teeny tiny short brushes to get those little eyeballs and things, which isn't true. You need a paintbrush that has a really nice tip on it, and it can be a little bit wider and it can be a little bit longer, just as long as the tip is really pointy, because the larger the brush is, the more paint it holds, and that's the idea. You want it to be able to hold some paint so you can go in there and dab it in. But if the paintbrush is so tiny, it can't hold any paint, and it's kind of worthless. So I've amassed a collection of different brushes over the years, and I've got my favorites over here. And you always take care of your brushes, because they're only as good as you take care of them. In other words, use some brush soap on them, keep them clean. Try not to ever let the paint go down into the ferrule at the end because it gets hard and then it ruins the brush, it splays it out. So you want to keep them really clean. Take care of your brushes. And keep one or two brushes aside for metallic colors like silver and gold, because once you use them in metallic, those little tiny flakes of metallic paint are always in that brush. You never get them out. So keep a couple brushes aside for metallic. I'd suggest if you don't have any, stop by AAA and pick up a set of brushes. You can buy a set of brushes like this for maybe 10 bucks. And you can see how small they are on top. But they're nice brushes. They've got a lot of bristle to them, nice points on them, and they're reasonable. So get some reasonable brushes to practice with, and then when you get really good, you can buy your Series 7 Sables and the really expensive brushes.